They say a dog is a man's best friend, but I never realized how true that was until Max started acting strange. I'm Peter, 27, and I've been married to Eva, 25, for 3 years. We live in a small apartment filled with books, her influence, pet toys mine, and a kind of quiet tension that's crept in over the past few months. Eva works at a bookstore she's adored since college. I work at an animal shelter, a job I've loved since I was a teenager. We couldn't be more different in some ways. She prefers neat, quiet spaces. I thrive in the chaos of wagging tails and barking dogs. But I thought we balanced each other out. Sure, she doesn't love Max the way I do, but she tolerates him. At least she used to. Max is a scruffy mutt I rescued before Eva and I got married. He's loyal, goofy, and full of love. But lately, he's been acting differently, more alert, more suspicious. Especially around Eva. At first, I thought I was imagining things. He'd stiffen when she walked into the room, his tail wagging half-heartedly, his ears flattened. He'd linger near her shoes, sniffing them obsessively, or sit by her bag like he was guarding something. It was odd, but I brushed it off. Maybe he was just picking up on the stress between us. Because there has been stress. Eva's been distant lately, working late, spending more time on her phone, and smiling less. I chalked it up to work pressure, or just a rough patch in our marriage. Every relationship has them, right? But there's a difference between a rough patch and something you can't name, but feel in your gut. The first real crack appeared a few weeks ago, when Eva started coming home later than usual. She said the bookstore was hosting more events, staying open later, and she needed to help out. It made sense at the time, but there was a shift in her behavior that didn't sit right with me. She was quieter, more guarded, and quick to snap if I asked too many questions about her day. Max seemed to notice too. He'd wait by the door when she got home, sniffing her shoes like they held some kind of secret. Then there was the incident with the receipt. Max pulled it from Eva's jacket pocket one night, wagging his tail proudly like he'd found treasure. It was from a coffee shop across town, dated the day before, a day Eva had told me she was working late. I laughed it off at first, teasing her about her guilty pleasure stops, but the unease in my gut didn't go away. Lately, I've been taking Max on longer walks in the evenings, partly for him and partly to clear my head. It's during those walks that I've started to notice little things. Eva's hurried phone calls when she thinks I'm not around, the way she avoids eye contact when I ask how her day was. I keep telling myself I'm overthinking it, that it's nothing. But Max doesn't seem to think so. Max was becoming more than just a dog. He was turning into a detective I didn't know I needed. His behavior toward Eva was growing stranger by the day, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. Dogs are perceptive, sure, but this wasn't just a case of him picking up on the tension between us. It felt deeper than that, like he was trying to tell me something I hadn't yet figured out. It started with little things. Max would sit by Eva's bag every night after she came home, his nose pressed to the fabric like he was catching a scent that didn't belong. At first, I thought he was just curious. Maybe he smelled something from the bookstore, or maybe Eva had stopped somewhere on her way home. But then, he started pawing at her bag, whining softly, as if he wanted me to notice. I tried brushing it off, telling myself I was overanalyzing a dog's quirks. But deep down, I knew Max wasn't one for random antics. He was trying to show me something. A few nights later, Max pulled another treasure from Eva's belongings, a crumpled scarf that had been stuffed into her bag. It wasn't hers. It was a men's scarf, slightly worn and faintly scented with cologne I didn't recognize. I held it in my hands for a long moment, my mind racing with questions. Why was it in her bag? Whose was it? And why hadn't she mentioned it? When Eva came home that evening, Max bolted to the door as usual. But instead of wagging his tail, he stood stiff, his ears back, watching her like she was a stranger. I asked her casually about the scarf, pretending to laugh it off as Max's latest find. She barely glanced at it, brushing me off with some vague excuse about borrowing it for the cold weather. Her tone was light, but her eyes betrayed something else, discomfort, maybe even guilt. That night, as she slept soundly beside me, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The scarf was just one piece of a puzzle I didn't want to solve, but Max had made it clear that there was more beneath the surface. His unease wasn't random, and the timeline of Eva's late nights, combined with the unexplained receipts and now this scarf, was starting to paint a picture I didn't want to see. Over the next few days, I started noticing more inconsistencies. Eva's phone, which she used to leave lying around the apartment, was now always in her hand or tucked away in her bag. When it buzzed, she'd glance at it quickly, her expression unreadable, before slipping it back into her pocket. She started coming home even later, claiming the bookstore was gearing up for a big sale, and she was needed to help with inventory. I wanted to believe her, but the feeling in my gut, and Max's behavior, told me otherwise. One evening, as I sat on the couch, Max climbed up beside me, resting his head on my lap. Eva had just left for another late shift, her coat and bag slung over her shoulder. Max watched the door long after it closed, his tail still, his eyes flicking between me and the empty space where she'd stood. It was like he was waiting for me to do something, to figure out what he already knew. That's when I noticed it. Eva had left her laptop on the kitchen counter, something she rarely did. She was usually meticulous about keeping her belongings in order, so the sight of it sitting open felt almost like an invitation. I hesitated for a long moment, guilt twisting in my stomach. But then I thought about the scarf, the receipts, the way she'd been acting around me and Max. If I wanted answers, this might be my only chance. I opened the laptop, my hands trembling slightly as I navigated through her browser history. Most of it was what I expected: bookstore-related searches, a few recipe sites, and the occasional YouTube video. But then, tucked between innocent tabs, I found something that made my heart sink. She'd searched for a coffee shop on the other side of town, the same one from the receipt Max had pulled from her bag weeks earlier. I clicked through, scrolling down the search results until I found the coffee shop's website. It wasn't far from her bookstore, but it wasn't exactly close either. There was no reason for her to be there, at least not one she'd shared with me. I leaned back in the chair, my mind racing. The pieces were starting to come together, and while I didn't have the full picture yet, I couldn't ignore the pattern. Max watched me from the couch, his head tilted slightly, his eyes sharp and alert. It was as if he knew I was getting closer to the truth, even if I didn't want to admit it yet. The next time Eva worked late, I decided to take Max for a walk near her bookstore. It wasn't an accusation, at least that's what I told myself. It was just a way to clear my head, to see if the unease in my chest was anything more than paranoia. But as I clipped Max's leash onto his collar and stepped out into the cool night air, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was about to uncover something I wasn't ready to face. Things with Max had escalated. His odd behavior toward Eva wasn't just suspicious anymore. It was downright alarming. For the past few weeks, he'd been distant around her, avoiding her touches and keeping his watchful, almost disapproving eyes on her every move. But now, it had turned into something I'd never seen before: aggression. It started one evening when Eva came home late again. She barely glanced in my direction as she slipped off her coat and shoes, muttering something about a long day. Max, who usually waited by the door for her return, was stationed on the other side of the room, his posture stiff, his tail low. As Eva walked toward the kitchen, Max's growl broke the silence. It wasn't the playful grumble he sometimes made during tug-of-war. It was deep, guttural, and full of warning. I froze, unsure of what to do. Eva turned, startled, and looked at him with a mix of confusion and annoyance. "What's his problem?" she asked, her voice sharp, but Max didn't back down. He moved closer, his growls intensifying, his teeth slightly bared. I called his name, trying to calm him down, but he ignored me, his focus entirely on her. Max lunged forward, barking loudly, stopping just short of biting. Eva stumbled backward, clutching the counter for support, her face pale. I stepped in quickly, grabbing Max by the collar and pulling him back, but his eyes never left her. It was like he'd snapped, and Eva was the sole target of his rage. Once I managed to calm him down and lead him into the other room, I turned back to Eva, who was standing frozen in the kitchen, her chest heaving. She was furious, of course, demanding to know what was wrong with Max and why I hadn't trained him better. But the more she ranted, the more something about her tone struck me as defensive rather than shocked. It wasn't just fear or anger. It was almost like she felt exposed. Over the next few days, Max's aggression didn't waver. Anytime Eva got close to him, he growled, his body tense, his fur bristling. If she tried to touch him, he'd snap, not to bite, but as a clear warning. It was completely out of character for him. Max had always been gentle, even with strangers, but something about Eva now set him off in a way I couldn't ignore. Eva, for her part, only grew more distant. She started avoiding Max altogether, refusing to be in the same room as him. She said it was because he was unpredictable, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she was hiding something. Something Max had picked up on long before I did. One night, after another tense evening where Max had growled every time Eva walked past, I sat alone in the living room, trying to make sense of it all. Max lay at my feet, his head resting on his paws, his eyes alert. He wasn't the problem. I was sure of that now. Dogs don't lie, and they don't act without reason. If Max was reacting this way to Eva, there had to be a reason. I thought back to all the little signs I'd ignored, the strange receipts, the scarf, the phone calls Eva took in hushed tones, and now Max's behavior. The pieces were coming together, and I didn't like the picture they were forming. The next morning, Eva left for work early, claiming she needed to help set up for an event at the bookstore. As soon as the door closed behind her, Max let out a low whine and moved to sit by the window, watching her leave. I sat beside him, scratching his ears absently as I tried to figure out my next move. Max's aggression wasn't random, and it wasn't just about Eva's neglect of him. He knew something he couldn't tell me, but was trying desperately to show me. For the first time, I allowed myself to fully consider what I'd been avoiding. That Eva wasn't just pulling away from me emotionally. She was hiding something much bigger, and Max had known it all along. Later that day, I decided to test a theory. I grabbed the scarf Max had pulled from Eva's bag weeks earlier and held it out to him. His reaction was immediate. His ears went back, his teeth bared, and a low growl rumbled in his chest. He sniffed the scarf briefly, then barked, loud and sharp, as if warning me about whatever it represented. The scarf didn't belong to a coworker. It wasn't an innocent explanation. It was something or someone Max recognized as a threat. My chest tightened as the realization hit me. Eva wasn't just spending time with someone else. She was doing it often enough that Max associated the scent with danger, with betrayal. That evening, I decided to dig deeper. I checked Eva's laptop again, scrolling through her emails and browsing history with a mix of guilt and determination. And then I saw it. A series of messages between her and someone listed simply as D. The tone was casual but familiar. Too familiar. One email mentioned meeting for coffee, another referenced a great time catching up, and then there was the final message that made my blood run cold. It's always good to see you again, Daniel. Daniel. Her ex-husband. The one she'd claimed to be completely done with. The one she'd said was nothing more than a mistake from her past. I leaned back in the chair, my hands trembling, Max at my side, growling softly. He'd known all along, hadn't he? My dog, my loyal, unflinching companion, had been trying to warn me from the start. I wasn't planning to catch Eva cheating that day. I wasn't planning anything, really, just another quiet evening trying to ignore the growing tension in our marriage. But life has a way of pulling the rug out from under you when you least expect it. It started innocently enough. I decided to take Max on a longer walk after work, hoping the fresh air would help me clear my head. Eva had mentioned she'd be working late again, helping with another big event at the bookstore. Max and I strolled through the neighborhood, winding our way toward downtown, where the bookstore sat nestled between a coffee shop and a bakery. I wasn't expecting to see anything unusual. I just needed the time to think. As we approached the bookstore, Max's demeanor changed. His ears perked up, his tail stiffened, and he tugged on the leash, pulling me toward the parking lot. I assumed he was just excited to explore, but when he started whining softly and sniffing the air with more urgency, my stomach twisted. He was acting the same way he had whenever Eva came home late, on edge, almost agitated. I decided to follow his lead, letting him guide me toward the back of the lot, where a row of cars was parked in the shadows. That's when I saw it. Eva's car was there, but she wasn't inside. Instead, she was standing a few feet away, leaning against the hood, her posture relaxed in a way I hadn't seen in months. She wasn't alone. Daniel. Her ex-husband was with her, standing close enough that their shoulders brushed. They were laughing, their voices low, their faces glowing in the soft light of a nearby street lamp. And then, before I could process what I was seeing, Daniel leaned in and kissed her. It wasn't a quick, casual peck. It was intimate, lingering, the kind of kiss you don't share with someone you're supposed to have left behind. I froze, my grip tightening on Max's leash as my mind raced. There it was, the proof I didn't want but couldn't ignore. All the late nights, the phone calls, the excuses, it all made sense now. Eva wasn't working late. She wasn't helping with events at the bookstore. She was meeting him. Max let out a low growl, breaking me out of my trance. I pulled him back, careful not to make any noise that would alert them to my presence. My heart was pounding, my hands shaking, but I knew I couldn't confront her. Not yet. If I wanted to do this right, I needed evidence, something concrete, undeniable. I fumbled for my phone, my movements clumsy as I opened the camera app. I snapped a series of photos, making sure to capture every detail. Their closeness, the kiss, the way they looked at each other. Each click of the shutter felt like a dagger to my chest, but I didn't stop. I needed this. I needed the truth in my hands, something she couldn't twist or deny when the time came. Once I had enough, I pulled Max away, retreating quietly into the shadows. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions, anger, betrayal, heartbreak, but I forced myself to stay calm. Bursting in and confronting them would accomplish nothing. I needed time to think, to plan my next move. That night, I sat in the living room, staring at the photos on my phone. Each image was a painful reminder of what I'd just witnessed, but it also gave me a strange sense of clarity. I wasn't imagining things. I wasn't being paranoid. The proof was right there in front of me, and there was no going back now. When Eva came home later that evening, her demeanor was casual, almost cheerful. She kissed me on the cheek, dropped her bag on the counter, and went on about how exhausting the event had been. I watched her carefully, noting the slight flush in her cheeks, the way she avoided making direct eye contact. She had no idea that I knew everything. I didn't say a word. Instead, I played along, nodding and smiling as if nothing had changed. Inside, though, I was already thinking several steps ahead. The photos were just the beginning. I needed more: texts, emails, anything that would paint the full picture of her betrayal. Over the next few days, I began quietly collecting evidence. I checked her phone when she left it unattended, scrolling through messages and call logs. I found several texts to Daniel, most of them innocent on the surface, but with a tone that felt too familiar, too intimate. I dug through her laptop, finding emails that confirmed they'd been meeting for weeks, if not months. Each discovery was another crack in the facade of our marriage, another confirmation of the truth I'd been trying to avoid. Through it all, I kept up the act. I smiled when she spoke, asked how her day was, even made her coffee in the mornings. But every moment felt like a lie, a performance I was putting on until I had everything I needed to confront her. Max, meanwhile, never wavered in his stance toward Eva. He continued to growl when she came near, his distrust as sharp as ever. In a way, his reaction grounded me, reminded me that I wasn't alone in this. He'd been trying to warn me all along, and now it was time to listen. The tension in our apartment had reached a boiling point. Max's aggression toward Eva wasn't just a small quirk anymore. It was a full-blown standoff. Every time she walked into the room, his low growls filled the air, his eyes fixed on her like she was an intruder in her own home. Eva, who had always barely tolerated Max, was losing what little patience she had left. It started innocuously enough, with Eva snapping at me about handling Max. She accused me of not training him properly, of letting his behavior spiral out of control. But her irritation quickly escalated into something more. She began shouting, her voice sharp and full of frustration, demanding to know why I wasn't doing anything to fix him. "He's your dog," she spat, her hands clenched into fists. "He's ruining this house. I can't even walk into a room without him acting like I'm the enemy." Her words hung in the air, her anger reverberating off the walls. Max stood near me, his body stiff, his growls steady and unwavering. He didn't flinch under her fury, and honestly, neither did I. I'd been bracing for this moment, knowing it was inevitable, but hearing her words still stung. She wasn't just angry at Max. She was projecting her guilt, trying to deflect from the growing chasm between us. Her yelling hit a nerve I hadn't expected. Before I could stop myself, the words spilled out, raw and unfiltered. At least Max has never betrayed me. The room went silent. Eva stared at me, her mouth slightly open, her expression shifting from anger to confusion to something I couldn't quite place. For a moment, it was like the air had been sucked out of the room, leaving nothing but the sound of Max's steady breathing. "What are you talking about?" she finally asked, her tone more defensive than confused. I realized my mistake immediately. I'd said too much, let my emotions get the better of me. But I wasn't ready for this confrontation. Not yet. I needed more time, more proof, more clarity before I laid it all out. So, I shook my head and muttered something about being tired, brushing it off as frustration about the argument. She didn't look convinced, but she let it drop, retreating to the bedroom and slamming the door behind her. Max stayed by my side, his head resting on my knee, his eyes watching the door she'd disappeared through. I stroked his fur absent-mindedly, my mind racing. My outburst had been impulsive, but it felt good to say it, almost like I'd been holding it in for weeks, maybe even months. Because it was true. Max had inte betrayed me. He'd been loyal, steadfast, and unflinchingly honest in a way Eva hadn't been in a long time. The rest of the evening was tense. Eva stayed in the bedroom, her silence louder than any argument we'd had before. I stayed in the living room with Max, staring at the photos and messages I'd collected, trying to piece together what to do next. My emotions were a storm: anger, sadness, betrayal. But through it all, there was a growing sense of resolve. This couldn't go on. Something had to give. Over the next few days, Eva's behavior became even more erratic. She started avoiding Max entirely, refusing to be in the same room as him. She blamed me for not disciplining him, claiming I was letting him ruin our marriage. But her defensiveness only made her guilt more obvious. She was lashing out because she knew, on some level, that Max wasn't the problem. She was. I kept my distance, staying quiet and observing as the cracks in our relationship widened. Every argument, every icy glance, every moment of tension brought me closer to the inevitable confrontation. And through it all, Max remained by my side, his loyalty unwavering. The moment I decided to file for divorce, everything clicked into place. I'd spent weeks collecting evidence, piecing together the fragments of Eva's betrayal, and watching her grow more distant and defensive. There was no doubt left in my mind. Her affair with Daniel wasn't just a mistake. It was a choice, and I wasn't going to let it define my life any longer. I took every piece of evidence I'd gathered, photos of their meetings, screenshots of texts and emails, and even the timeline that Max had helped expose, and handed it over to my lawyer. The case was airtight. Eva wouldn't be able to deny it, not with the overwhelming proof staring her in the face. I didn't tell her I'd filed for divorce right away. Instead, I let the papers do the talking when they were served to her at home. The look on her face when she opened that envelope was something I'll never forget. Shock, anger, and, for the briefest moment, what almost looked like regret. She demanded to talk, to explain, but I stayed firm. There was nothing left to say. Her actions had spoken louder than any excuse she could offer. As the news of our divorce spread through our small town, so did the rumors. People started talking, and it didn't take long for the truth about her affair to come out. Small towns thrive on gossip, and Eva's betrayal with her ex-husband quickly became the scandal of the year. It didn't help that Daniel was also well known in the community, which only fueled the fire. The fallout was swift. Eva lost her job at the bookstore, not because of the affair itself, but because of how publicly it had played out. Customers stopped coming in, uncomfortable with the whispers and stares, and her boss decided it was easier to let her go than deal with the ongoing drama. She tried to spin it as unfair treatment, but the damage was already done. Meanwhile, life began to stabilize for me. Max and I settled into a new routine, one that felt quieter but also more peaceful. The divorce proceedings were straightforward, thanks to the evidence I'd provided, and I was granted full ownership of our apartment and primary custody of Max. Not that Eva would have fought for him anyway. Reflecting on everything, I've realized how much I've learned from this experience. Betrayal, no matter how painful, has a way of forcing you to reevaluate what you want and need in life. For me, it taught me the importance of listening to my instincts. I'd ignored the red flags for too long, brushing off my doubts and Max's behavior until the evidence was undeniable. Trusting yourself is crucial, even when it's uncomfortable. I also learned the value of patience and planning. It was tempting to confront Eva the moment I suspected something was wrong, but holding back allowed me to gather the proof I needed to protect myself during the divorce. Emotions can cloud judgment, but staying calm and focused ensured I could move forward with clarity and purpose. Most importantly, I've come to appreciate the power of loyalty. Max was the only one who remained unwaveringly honest and steadfast throughout this ordeal. His instincts, his loyalty, and his unshakable presence reminded me that trust and love should be unconditional. People can learn a lot from dogs. They never lie, and they always protect the ones they love. If I could offer advice to anyone going through something similar, it would be this: don't ignore your gut. If something feels off, dig deeper. Gather the facts, protect yourself, and take action when you're ready. And when the dust settles, focus on rebuilding. Not just your life, but also your sense of self. Betrayal doesn't define you unless you let it. You deserve peace, honesty, and love, and the best way to find those things is to let go of what no longer serves you. For now, it's just Max and me, and that's more than enough. The quiet feels like freedom, and every wag of his tail reminds me that life moves forward, even after the hardest moments. To anyone reading this, trust yourself. You're stronger than you think, and better days are waiting.